Historical conclusion on the earliest evidence for Jesus' resurrection. When historians study the origins of Christianity, they begin with the earliest surviving sources, rather than later traditions. Among these, the undisputed letters of the Apostle Paul are considered the earliest Christian documents, written approximately AD 48 to 62, only about 20 to 30 years after Jesus' crucifixion. These letters are widely accepted as authentic by scholars across the spectrum, including Christians, Jews, agnostics, and atheists. From these writings and other first-century sources, historians generally agree on several points. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under Roman authority. Paul was a real historical figure whose core letters are genuine first-century documents. Paul sincerely believed he experienced an appearance of the risen Jesus. Jesus' earliest followers sincerely believed they encountered him alive after his death. And belief in Jesus' resurrection was not a legend that developed centuries later, but was proclaimed within the earliest years of the Christian movement. One of the strongest pieces of evidence is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7. In this passage, Paul states that he is passing on a tradition he himself had received. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Many historians conclude that this creed originated only a few years after Jesus' death, making it one of the earliest preserved statements of Christian belief. Where scholars differ is in explaining these facts. Christian historians argue that the resurrection is the best explanation for the historical evidence. Non-Christian historians generally agree that the disciples and Paul genuinely believed they had experiences of the risen Jesus, but conclude that history, by itself, cannot determine whether a supernatural resurrection occurred. Regardless of one's religious beliefs, there is broad scholarly agreement that Paul's letters provide direct first-century testimony to what the earliest Christians believed and proclaimed about Jesus. How historians reached these conclusions. The historical conclusions about Jesus, Paul, and the earliest Christian movement are based on the analysis of first-century documents rather than later church tradition. Historians evaluate these writings using standard historical criteria, including authorship, dating, proximity to the events, corroboration from multiple sources, and consistency with the historical context. First, Paul's letters are the earliest evidence. Scholars begin with Paul's undisputed letters because they are the earliest surviving Christian writings, dating to approximately AD 48 to 62. Since Paul personally knew key leaders of the early church, including Peter and James, they are treated as first-hand historical evidence for what the earliest Christians believed. Second, early testimony about the resurrection. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, Paul says he is passing on a tradition that he received. Most scholars conclude this is an early Christian creed that predates Paul's letter, likely originating within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion. This indicates that belief in Jesus' resurrection was present from the very beginning of the Christian movement, rather than developing generations later. Third, Paul's meetings with eyewitnesses. In Galatians, chapters 1 and 2, Paul describes visiting Jerusalem and meeting Peter and James, Jesus' brother. Because this information comes from Paul's own letter rather than a later biography, historians consider it strong evidence that Paul had direct contact with the leaders of the earliest Christian community. Fourth, multiple independent sources. The accounts of Jesus' crucifixion and the disciples' belief that he rose from the dead are found in several independent sources, including Paul's letters, the four Gospels, and other early Christian traditions. Non-Christian writers from the 1st and early 2nd centuries also refer to Jesus' execution, reinforcing the historical conclusion that he was crucified. Fifth, agreement across different scholars. Christian, Jewish, agnostic, and atheist scholars often disagree about theology, but many reach the same historical conclusions because they are examining the same ancient documents. They generally agree that Jesus was crucified, that Paul genuinely believed he encountered the risen Jesus, and that Jesus' earliest followers sincerely believed they had seen him alive after his death. The main disagreement is not over these historical facts, but over their interpretation. Christian scholars conclude that the resurrection best explains the evidence. Skeptical scholars generally conclude that the disciples had sincere experiences they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus, but argue that historical methods alone cannot determine whether a miracle occurred.